The wolf at my feet was not supposed to survive the night. I knew it the moment I found him, half buried in the frozen mud at the edge of the ashwood, his breathing shallow and uneven, his massive dark form barely distinguishable from the shadows between the roots. The wind was cutting that evening, carrying the smell of pine sap and cold iron, and I had only gone out to gather the last of the frost herb before the ground hardened completely for winter. I was not supposed to be a rescuer. I was not supposed to be anything, really. That was the entire point of being what I was. An Omega without a pack is a quiet kind of nothing. My name is Willa, and I had learned very early in life that invisibility was not a flaw. It was a survival technique. In Crestfall, the northern settlement that clung to the mountain's edge like moss on whetstone, I occupied the smallest possible space. I kept my pale blonde hair braided tight and close, wore colors that matched the walls, spoke only when spoken to, and spent my days doing what Omegas in settlements without standing do. I healed, quietly, without recognition. I ground herbs in the back of Elder Marin's hall. I stitched wounds no one else wanted to touch. I sat beside the feverish through the long nights and kept notes in the margins of old medical texts that no one else bothered to read anymore. I was useful. I was not valued. There is a difference, and it lives in the chest like a small, permanent bruise. So when I crouched beside the fallen wolf in the frozen dark and pressed 2 fingers to the pulse at his throat, I was not being brave. I was being automatic. Something was breathing and suffering, and my hands already knew what to do before my mind had finished forming a question. He was enormous, even collapsed and still. There was a sense of contained mass to him that made the forest feel smaller. His hair, long and braided in parts, fanned dark against the pale mud. The leather and fur of his clothing told me he was not from Crestfall. The old territorial markings sewn into the collar of his armor told me something worse. He was from the High Packs, northern royalty, the kind of wolf whose name made settlement alphas lower their eyes. My hands went cold for a reason that had nothing to do with the temperature. I should have gone for help. I should have run back to the settlement and found someone with rank, someone with authority. Someone whose standing in the pack structure would have made it appropriate to touch a man like this. An Omega kneeling over an injured High Alpha. In any other circumstance, that image alone would have been enough to earn me a formal rejection, documented and announced before the whole of Crestfall, as if I hadn't already received one of those. 2 years ago, in the middle of the autumn gathering, a beta named Corvin had stood before our settlement's assembly and declared, in the careful language the old laws permitted, that he was severing his intended alliance with me. He had cited incompatibility of rank. He had cited my limited social function. He had not looked at me once while he said it. I had stood very still. I had not cried. I had gone home, sat on the floor of my single-room dwelling, and listened to the wind move through the gap under the door for a long time. Then the next morning, I had gone back to Elder Marin's hall and ground more herbs, because there was always more to be done, and the herbs did not care what rank I was. But that memory, Corvin's profile as he turned away, the sound of the formal words, the silence that followed, had a way of surfacing at inconvenient moments. Like now, kneeling in frozen mud over an unconscious High Alpha, who, if he woke and found me here, might look at me the same way. I pushed the thought aside. His breathing was worsening. The wound was deep, along his left side. Something had struck him hard, and the cold was making everything worse. I did not let myself think about what could have done this to someone his size. I opened the satchel I carried everywhere, and worked quickly, the way Elder Marin had taught me in the early years, before she began giving the more visible cases to the 2 beta healers whose families had standing. My fingers found the yarrow compress, the pressed seal moss that slowed bleeding in cold conditions, the thin strips of cured linen I kept wound at the bottom of every pouch out of habit. I worked without speaking. The trees stood around us like witnesses who had decided not to interfere. He was alive when I finished. His breathing had steadied. Not strong, but no longer the broken, stuttering rhythm I'd found. I had done what I could in the field. The rest required warmth, rest, and sustained care over days, none of which the frozen forest floor could provide. Getting him to my dwelling was a problem I solved one stubborn step at a time. My home was at the far edge of Crestfall, not by choice, but by the quiet social mathematics of settlement living. The small, the low-ranked, the unaffiliated, we lived where the buildings thinned and the wind came through stronger. It was a 15-minute walk from the Ashwood, under normal circumstances. That night, with a half-conscious High Alpha's arm draped over my shoulders, and his full weight shifting unpredictably with every step, it took nearly an hour. He stirred twice. The first time, he made a sound low in his throat, not quite words, not quite a growl. And I said quietly, "I'm not going to hurt you. Keep walking." The second time, his eyes opened for just a moment. They were a striking pale blue, almost silver in the dark, and they focused on my face with an intensity that made me miss a step. Then they closed again, and I kept walking. I settled him on the cot I normally reserved for patients, built the fire higher than I usually allowed myself in terms of wood use, and spent the next several hours working through the night the way I always did, methodically, carefully, without fuss. I checked the wound, changed the compress, monitored his temperature with the back of my wrist against his forehead, and made notes in the margin of my log in the small, precise handwriting that no one ever read. By the time the gray light of early morning began to press through the gaps in the shutters, his color had improved. His breathing was deep and even. He would live. I sat in the chair beside the cot and permitted myself exactly 3 minutes of exhausted stillness, my eyes closed, my hands wrapped around a cooling cup of pine bark tea. Then I heard the sound of boots outside, multiple sets, heavy and deliberate, and someone knocked on my door with the kind of authority that doesn't wait to be invited. I set the cup down and stood. Whatever came next, I told myself, I was ready. I was not ready. The door opened before I reached it, and the man who filled the frame was not one of Crestfall's settlement guards. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the markings of a high-pack lieutenant across his collar, and behind him, 2 more just like him, their eyes scanning my small dwelling with an expression that managed to be both professional and deeply unsettling. "We are looking," the first man said, in a voice that expected to be answered immediately. "For our king." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. From the cot behind me, a low, certain voice spoke. "You found him." I did not turn around right away. That is something I noticed about myself in the seconds that followed, that my first instinct was not to spin toward the voice, not to react with the visible, flustered panic that would have been perfectly understandable given the circumstances. Instead, I stood very still in the space between the door and the cot, my hands folded in front of me, and I breathed once, slowly, the way Elder Marin had taught me to do before any procedure that required steadiness. Then I turned. He was sitting up. That alone felt significant, because 3 hours ago, I had not been certain he would be sitting up ever again. The firelight caught the angles of his face, the hard line of his jaw, the braids pulled back from his temples, the pale blue eyes that were now fully open and fully alert, and fixed on me with an expression I could not immediately name. Not gratitude, not hostility, something more careful than either. King Adrian of the Northern High Packs looked at me the way I imagined he looked at maps before a campaign, like he was calculating distances and deciding which route was worth the risk. "Leave us," he said, without looking at his men. The lieutenant in the doorway shifted. "My king, protocol requires—" "I know what protocol requires." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Leave us." They left. The door closed. The fire popped once in the silence, and I became acutely aware that my dwelling, which had always felt adequately sized for one person who kept mostly to herself, had somehow shrunk by half. I moved to the small table where my supplies were laid out and began reorganizing them. It gave my hands something to do. "You kept me alive," he said. It was not a question. "Your wound was manageable," I said. The cold was the more immediate problem. Another hour in that temperature and the outcome would have been different. A pause. "You carried me." "Assisted you. There is a distinction. You were partially conscious for portions of the walk." I kept my eyes on the supplies. "You should rest for at least 2 more days before you consider traveling. The seal moss compress will need to be changed this evening, and again tomorrow morning. I can leave instructions if you prefer to have your own people manage it, but the technique requires some precision, or the wound will reopen." Another silence. Longer this time. "What is your name?" I set down the packet of yarrow I had been unnecessarily refolding. "Willa." "Your rank?" There it was. The question that always came eventually, the one that sorted people into the categories that determined how a conversation would proceed from that point forward. I had answered it enough times to have lost most of the sting of it, the way a bruise eventually becomes just a patch of yellow that you stop noticing. "Omega," I said. "Unaffiliated." I watched his expression for the flicker, the small, involuntary recalibration that crossed most faces when they received that answer. The slight withdrawal, the adjustment in tone. I had become very good at detecting it, the way you become good at detecting weather shifts when you spend enough time outdoors. It did not come. He looked at me steadily and said, "An unaffiliated Omega who carries field medical supplies into the Ashwood after dark and knows how to use seal moss compress in sub-freezing temperatures." "I'm a healer," I said. "Or near enough to one. I don't have a formal title because titles require pack standing, and I don't have pack standing. But I've been doing this work for 6 years, and the people I treat recover, so the distinction has always seemed somewhat academic to me." Something shifted in his expression then. Not quite a smile, because I suspected full smiles were not a frequent occurrence for a man who carried himself with that particular quality of contained authority. But something loosened, fractionally, around the eyes. "Sit down," he said. "Please." The please surprised me enough that I sat. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the fire, and I had the sense of someone organizing their thoughts with the same precision I used to organize my supplies, deliberately, without wasted motion. In the daylight coming through the shutters, I could see the scar at the corner of his jaw that the darkness had hidden last night. Old. Whatever had left it had not been minor. "I was ambushed," he said finally. "On the high ridge above the Ashwood. 3 members of the Duskfang faction, who have apparently decided that the transition period following my father's passing presents an opportunity worth exploiting." He said it without heat, in the tone of someone reporting a weather event. "My escort was separated from me in the trees. They will have been searching through the night." "Are you in danger here?" I asked. Directly, because I had found over the years that direct questions saved significant amounts of time. He looked at me. "Not from the Duskfang. They won't move on a settlement." A pause. "Are you asking if you are in danger?" "I'm asking if I need to send for more supplies or more people." He was quiet for a moment. "No, not yet." He shifted against the cot, and the slight tightening around his eyes told me the movement had cost him something. The more pressing concern is what happens when my escort arrives, and Crestfall's Alpha learns where I spent the night. I understood what he meant. I was not naive about the social architecture of pack politics. A king's security detail arriving at an unaffiliated Omega's home would generate exactly the kind of attention that settlement politics were made of. Elder Halvard, Crestfall's Alpha, a broad, tradition-minded man who had looked through me at every assembly for 6 years, would want explanations. He would want to be the center of them. He would want the story told in a way that positioned Crestfall favorably and minimized the uncomfortable detail of who had actually provided the care. "I'll manage whatever questions arise," I said. "You sound certain." "I've had practice being an inconvenient detail that people prefer to rearrange." He looked at me again with that same careful attention, the kind that felt different from being looked at the way I was usually looked at, which was to say, past. "I would like to know," he said slowly, "why you brought me here instead of alerting the settlement." I considered the question honestly, because by the time I had found someone with the authority to make a decision, and that person had considered the political implications, and the appropriate parties had been notified, and everything had been done in the correct order with the correct people present. I paused. "You would have been past helping. And you didn't think the risk to yourself was worth considering?" The risk to myself for helping someone injured in the forest seemed significantly lower than the risk to you of remaining in it. The calculation was straightforward. He did not respond immediately. Outside, I could hear the sounds of Crestfall beginning its morning. The clatter from the cookhouse, a child calling something across the square, the stamp of boots on frozen ground. Normal sounds. The world proceeding as it always did, unaware that anything had changed. Except that something had. I could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not visible yet, but present. A new weight in the atmosphere. "You'll be compensated," Adrian said. "Formally and properly. I'll ensure that isn't necessary. It is." His voice carried a finality that I recognized as non-negotiable, the tone of someone who had spent his life making decisions that other people were required to accept. "What you did last night was not small, Willa. I won't treat it as small." My name and his voice landed differently than I expected. I looked away toward the fire. That was when the knock came. Not the careful knock of someone uncertain of their welcome. The solid proprietary knock of someone who considered themselves entitled to whatever was on the other side of a door. Elder Halvard's knock. I knew it the way I knew the sound of approaching rain. I rose and opened the door. He stood on my threshold in his formal morning cloak, two of his senior betas flanking him, his expression arranged in the practiced combination of authority and benevolence that he used for situations requiring management. He looked at me, and then past me, and the moment his eyes found Adrian sitting on the cot, his entire bearing changed. The shift was instantaneous. The straightening of posture, the recalibration of expression, the unconscious adjustment that hierarchy produced in people who had spent their lives operating within it. "My king," Halvard said, his voice smoothing into deference. "We received word that your escort was searching the northern ridge. Crestfall stands ready to offer every resource. Elder Halvard," Adrian's voice was even. "I am aware of what Crestfall stands ready to offer. I am currently benefiting from what one of your settlement's healers has already provided." A pause, deliberate and weighted. "I trust she has your full support and standing in this matter." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. I kept my eyes on the middle distance and waited to hear how Halvard would answer, knowing that his response in this moment, whatever it was, would be the first real thing to change in 6 years. Elder Halvard said, "Of course." 2 words. Smooth, immediate, delivered with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades saying exactly what the room required. He even smiled, the wide, generous smile he reserved for assemblies when he wanted the settlement to feel unified and well-led. I had heard that smile in his voice 100 times. It had never once been directed at me. "Willa is one of our most dedicated healers," he continued in the tone of someone describing a possession they had recently remembered they owned. "We are fortunate to have her." I did not react. I had learned over many years of being invisible in rooms where decisions were made that the moment you visibly register the absurdity of a situation, you lose the only advantage invisibility provides. So I stood quietly with my hands folded and let Elder Halvard construct his revised version of events, and I watched Adrian's face from the edge of my vision. Adrian was watching Halvard. His expression had not changed, but there was something in the stillness of it that reminded me of deep water. Calm on the surface, with significant movement underneath. Crestfall is grateful for the opportunity to serve, Halvard was saying. We would be honored to provide our king with proper accommodation during his recovery. The main hall has been prepared. I'll remain here, Adrian said. A beat of silence. My king, the main hall offers considerably more. I'm aware of what the main hall offers. Still that same unraised voice. I'll remain here for the duration of my recovery. My escort can be quartered in the hall. I'd appreciate the space being made available to them. He paused. My healer requires access to her supplies, and disrupting an ongoing course of treatment carries risk I'm not willing to accept. My healer. I felt the phrase land in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Halvard's smile remained in place, but something behind his eyes recalculated rapidly. The two betas flanking him exchanged a glance so brief that most people would have missed it. I did not miss it. Naturally, Halvard said. Whatever our king requires. He looked at me then. Actually looked at me, with the direct attention that he had withheld for 6 years as naturally as breathing. Willa, you have the full resources of the settlement at your disposal. Thank you, Elder, I said, and my voice came out perfectly steady, which I considered a minor personal achievement. Halvard withdrew with his betas, and the door closed, and the room settled back into its fire and morning light quiet. You didn't enjoy that, Adrian said. I began checking the compress, partly because it needed checking, and partly because it gave me a reason to focus on something other than his face. I don't know what you mean. When he said you were one of their most dedicated healers, I heard something careful in his voice. Not mockery, nothing so careless as that. More like someone reading a text and noting the places where the words didn't match the meaning. Your expression didn't change, but your hands did. Very slightly. I paused for exactly 1 second, then continued. I've worked in this settlement for 6 years without formal standing or recognition. Elder Halvard has spoken to me directly perhaps 4 times in that period, and 2 of those occasions were to redirect a medical question to one of the beta healers with less experience but better family connections. I lifted the edge of the compress, examined the wound beneath, healing cleanly, which was a relief, and replaced it with the efficiency of long practice. What he said this morning wasn't untrue. It was simply about 5 years late. Adrian was quiet for a moment. And the rejection? 2 years ago. My hand stopped. I looked up at him. He met my gaze without apology, and I understood that the question was not intrusive in the way it would have been from anyone else. He was a king. He had presumably been briefed on the settlement's social structure the moment his escort had identified where he was. Rejection records were public documents. He would have known before Halvard knocked on the door. You read the settlement records, I said. My lieutenant did. He's thorough. A pause. I asked him to tell me about you specifically. Something about that phrasing, about you specifically, sat differently than I expected. I filed it away in the part of my mind that I used for things I couldn't yet categorize. The rejection was 2 years ago, I said, returning to my work. It was handled according to proper procedure. There's nothing unusual about it. I kept my voice the way I kept my hands, steady, professional, focused on the task. Omegas without pack standing are low-priority alliance candidates. Corvin made a practical decision. Did it feel practical? The question was quiet and direct, and landed somewhere I wasn't prepared for. I set down the linen strip I had been unwinding and looked at the fire instead of at him. No, I said after a moment. It felt like being told out loud what I had already suspected for a long time. that the work I did was acceptable, but the person doing it was not. I paused. But I've found that feeling and fact are two different territories, and living in the feeling too long doesn't improve the facts. So I went back to work. The fire shifted. Outside, Crestfall's morning was growing louder, the sounds of the settlement expanding into its day. More voices, more movement, the smell of cookhouse smoke drifting under the door. "My father died 11 weeks ago," Adrian said. I turned to look at him. The shift in subject was unexpected, but his voice had changed in a way that made the non sequitur feel like its own kind of answer, like he was responding not to what I had said but to something underneath it. "I know," I said quietly. The news reached Crestfall before the first frost. "The Duskfang faction has been operating on the assumption that transition equals weakness." He looked at the wall beyond the fire, and for a moment, he looked less like a king and more like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had simply gotten accustomed to the weight. "They are not entirely wrong that this period is difficult. Consolidating alliances across 17 pack territories while simultaneously managing succession challenges requires..." He stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "Because you've been awake for what I estimate is close to 30 hours, I said. "You're mildly feverish. Your wound hurts more than you're indicating, and I'm the only person in this room who isn't required to find you imposing." I picked up the pine bark tea I had prepared earlier and held it out. "Drink this. It will help the fever." He looked at the cup, then at me. Then he took it. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You didn't know I existed until last night," I pointed out. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He drank the tea. I busied myself with the morning's medical log, making notes in my small, precise handwriting. Outside, I could hear Crestfall reorganizing itself around the presence of a king, voices carrying a different pitch than usual, footsteps moving with more purpose, the particular vibration of a community that has suddenly remembered it is being observed. 2 days passed in the close, quiet rhythm of recovery. His escort, 6 wolves in total, formidable and watchful, established a perimeter that made Crestfall's betas visibly nervous and Elder Halvard visibly gratified. The settlement buzzed with the significance of the visit, stories already shifting and expanding in the way of settlement stories, the details rearranging themselves to place important people closer to the center. I was aware, in an abstract way, that I had become briefly significant by proximity. Women who had not spoken to me in months found reasons to knock on my door. Younger pack members lingered near my dwelling, with transparent casualness. Even Corvin had apparently been seen near the eastern path, which was not his usual route, though he had the sense not to actually appear at my threshold. I treated my patients. I changed Adrian's compress morning and evening. I made tea and noted improvement and kept my log. On the second evening, he asked to see the medical texts I kept on the narrow shelf above the supply table, and I gave them to him, and he read with the focused attention of someone who considered books a serious matter, and we sat in a companionable quiet that I found, to my own surprise, entirely natural. On the morning of the 3rd day, he was well enough to stand without assistance. I watched him move carefully across the room, and knew that the portion of this I had come to think of, privately, as ours was ending. The outside world, the 17 pack territories, the Duskfang threat, the machinery of succession, had been waiting with the patient certainty of something that does not need to rush. "I'll be leaving tomorrow," he said, without turning from the window. "I know," I said. A pause. The gray winter light fell across the floor between us. "I want you to come to the high pack seat," he said, as a formally recognized healer, with standing, title, and appropriate compensation. He turned then. "Not as a favor. As a position that has been vacant for 2 years, and that I am now certain I have found the right person to fill." The fire popped softly in the silence. Outside, I could hear the wind beginning to move through the ashwood, the sound it made when the temperature was dropping toward evening. A low, serious sound, like a warning or a beginning. I looked at him and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have spent years reading situations from the margins, that this offer was real. That it was being made by someone who did not say things he did not mean. That accepting it would change every fact of my life, and not one of the feelings I had accumulated about those facts over 6 years. And I understood something else, quieter and more complicated, that I was not yet ready to examine directly. "I'll need a day to think," I said. "Take 2, he said, and almost smiled. I did not need 2 days. I needed 1 evening, a long walk to the edge of the ashwood, and an honest conversation with myself that I had been postponing for approximately 6 years. I stood at the tree line where I had found Adrian 3 nights ago and looked at the frozen ground and the place between the roots where he had lain. And I thought about what it meant that I was standing here considering a choice, rather than simply accepting whatever was handed to me. That, I realized, was already different. I went back and told him yes before the cookhouse fires were lit for morning. The next hours moved with the particular velocity of things that have been decided and now simply need to be executed. Adrian's escort reorganized with quiet efficiency. Elder Halvard arrived to perform the formal farewell with the careful enthusiasm of a man who understood that this visit, whatever its origins, had elevated Crestfall's standing in ways that would take months to fully calculate. He shook hands and made speeches, and at one point gestured toward me with the proud, proprietary air of someone presenting their own idea. I let him. It cost me nothing, and the morning was cold, and I had packing to do. My dwelling took less time to pack than I expected, which told me something I decided not to dwell on for too long. That 6 years in a place can leave very shallow roots when the place itself never fully claimed you. My medical supplies filled 2 cases. My texts filled a 3rd. My clothing fit into a single travel bag. I stood in the empty room for a moment before I closed the door, listening to the particular silence of a space that has been vacated, and I felt something I could not quite name. Not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, but the complicated mixture of both that arrives at real endings. Then I picked up my cases and walked out into the cold morning air. The journey to the high-pack seat took 4 days by the route Adrian's escort chose. Longer than the direct path, but the direct path crossed the high ridge where the Duskfang had staged their ambush, and no one suggested it. We traveled through dense pine forest that gradually gave way to older growth, the trees growing taller and further apart, the light between them taking on the particular quality of places that have been undisturbed for a long time. I rode in a covered transport with 2 of the escort wolves, and spent most of the journey reading or watching the forest through the small window, cataloging what I saw the way I cataloged everything, carefully, with attention to detail. Adrian rode ahead with his senior lieutenants. I caught sight of him occasionally through the window, his profile against the gray sky, the dark braids, the way he held himself in the saddle with the unconscious ease of someone who had been doing it since childhood. We did not speak much during the journey. There was a quality to the silence between us, though, that felt different from ordinary silence. It had texture to it, the kind that builds when 2 people are both paying attention to something they haven't yet decided how to name. On the 2nd night, we stopped at a way station, a long stone building maintained for exactly this purpose, warm and well supplied. The escort settled into their routines, and I ate at the long common table and listened to the conversations around me with the attentive quiet I had always used in new environments. Adrian's people were, I noticed, more varied than I had expected. His senior lieutenant, a sharp-faced woman named Sarah, ran the logistics of the journey with a precision that made Elder Halvard's betas look approximate by comparison. The youngest of the escort, a wolf barely past his first decade of training named Pip, had an earnest quality that made him volunteer for every task no one else wanted, and who I caught studying one of my medical texts with furtive interest when he thought no one was watching. "You can borrow it," I told him, passing the fire. He startled, then, reading my expression, took the book with both hands and a seriousness that made me think he would not lose it. On the third morning, Sarah fell into step beside me as we prepared to resume travel. She was direct in the way of people who consider indirectness a waste of good time. "You're wondering what to expect," she said. It was not a question. "I'm observing," I said. "I find it's more useful." Something in her expression shifted. A small, evaluating quality, like a door opening slightly to check the weather. The high-pack seat is not like Crestfall. It's larger, louder, and considerably more political. There are 4 other healers already in residence, 2 of whom will resent your appointment on principle, and 1 of whom will attempt to make you feel unwelcome within your first week. She paused. His name is Edric. He's been angling for the head healer position for 3 years, and will view you as an obstacle. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I'm telling you because wasting good healers to politics is something I find personally irritating." She looked ahead at the road. "The king doesn't give positions he doesn't mean. He also doesn't explain his decisions to people who question them, which sometimes creates friction. You'll find your footing faster if you understand that the position is real and not contingent on anyone else's approval." I considered this. "And you're telling me this because I was in Crestfall the morning after you brought him in," she said simply. "I saw the wound. I saw the work you'd done in field conditions, in the dark, alone, without the supplies a proper medical station would have provided. And then I saw you stand in that room while Halvard took credit for your settlement's dedication, and your face didn't move." She looked at me sideways. That kind of composure is either very well trained or very deep. Either way, it's useful. We reached the high-pack seat on the afternoon of the 4th day. I had formed expectations during the journey, had imagined something large and fortified, and the reality confirmed the imagination while exceeding it in details I hadn't anticipated. The seat was built into the side of a granite ridge, the stone of its walls continuous with the stone of the mountain, not placed against it, but grown from it, or so it appeared. Towers rose at intervals, and the great main gate was flanked by carved figures that had been worn by weather into something more suggestion than depiction. It was old, older than Crestfall by centuries. I could feel the weight of it. My quarters were in the healer's wing, a set of 3 connected rooms that represented more dedicated space than I had occupied in my entire time in Crestfall. There was a proper preparation room with a stone work table, a patient room with 2 cots and good window light, and a private room for sleeping that had a small hearth and a shelf that would accommodate all of my texts with room remaining. I stood in the preparation room and ran my hand along the stone work table and felt something shift quietly in my chest. Edric appeared at the door within the hour. He was a man somewhere in his middle years, carefully maintained in appearance, with the particular expression of someone who has organized their self-worth around a position they have not yet achieved. He looked at me with the practiced neutrality of someone performing an assessment. "You're the Omega from Crestfall," he said. "I'm the healer from Crestfall," I said pleasantly, and began unpacking my first case. "Willa, you must be Edric. I understand you've been with the High Pack for several years. You'll be an invaluable resource as I learn the specific protocols here." He blinked. He had come prepared for defensiveness, and I had given him its precise opposite, and the recalibration cost him his entire opening. He said something vague about protocols and retreated. I unpacked my second case and allowed myself a small, private satisfaction. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most demanding of my life, and also, underneath the strangeness and the demand, something I could not immediately name but that felt, quietly, carefully, like rightness. I learned the High Pack's medical histories. I reorganized the supply inventory in a way that made Edric visibly irritated and the other healers visibly relieved. I treated a recurring joint condition in Sarah's left wrist that had apparently been managed inadequately for 2 years, and after the third treatment she nodded at me in the corridor with an expression that, for Sarah, constituted high praise. Pip appeared in the preparation room regularly, ostensibly to return books and borrow others. Actually, I suspected, to ask questions he was too self-conscious to ask elsewhere. I answered them. He had a good mind and a genuine instinct for the work, and I told him so. And the way his entire bearing changed when I said it told me something about how rarely he had been told things like that. I saw Adrian in the formal contexts, the morning assemblies where the day's territorial reports were delivered, the occasional hall dinners where the senior pack figures gathered. He was different there than he had been in my small dwelling in Crestfall, larger in the way of people whose authority fills a room that is properly sized for it. He listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, the room reorganized itself around his words. He looked at me sometimes across those formal spaces with the same careful, assessing quality I had first noticed in the firelight. I looked back, steadily, the way I had learned to look at things I needed to understand. One evening, 6 weeks after my arrival, there was a commotion in the lower hall. A runner arrived from the Eastern Territories, young, out of breath, with the particular urgency of someone carrying news they wish they weren't carrying. I was in the preparation room and heard the raised voices and was already reaching for my emergency case when Sarah appeared in the doorway. "Duskfang," she said. "They've moved on the Fern Hollow settlement. 40 wolves, some hurt badly. They're bringing them here." She met my eyes. "All 4 of the other healers are currently managing the winter fever outbreak in the lower town. You're what we have." I picked up the case. "How long until they arrive?" 2 hours, maybe less. "I'll need the preparation room cleared and the patient room fully supplied. Tell Pip to find me immediately. He's been watching long enough to be useful tonight." I moved past her into the corridor. "And tell the king that I'll need his authority to requisition the South Hall as overflow space. The 2 rooms won't be enough." Sarah was already moving. "I'll tell him." "Tell him also," I said over my shoulder, already calculating what the next 2 hours needed to contain, "that I'll require 3 more experienced hands, and that I don't particularly care about their rank, only their steadiness under pressure." I heard distantly what might have been Sarah almost laughing. I went to work. The wolves from Fern Hollow arrived in the gray hour before dawn. There were 38 of them. I counted, because counting was the first thing I did in any emergency. The immediate conversion of chaos into numbers that could be managed. 17 required immediate attention. 9 had wounds that could wait 2 hours but not 4. The remaining 12 were shaken and exhausted but physically whole, and I directed them to the South Hall with Pip and a beta named Rowena, who had turned out to be one of the 3 steady hands Sarah had found for me, instructing them to keep everyone warm, hydrated, and calm. The next several hours exist in my memory the way intense nights always do. Not as a continuous thread, but as a series of very clear, very bright images with the connective tissue removed. The smell of pine resin and cold mud that came in with the Fern Hollow wolves. The sound of Pip's voice, surprisingly calm, talking a frightened older wolf through a breathing technique I had taught him 3 weeks ago. Rowena holding a lamp at exactly the right angle without being asked twice. Edric appearing at some point, his careful neutrality dissolved by the simple pressure of too much work for too few hands, falling into the rhythm of the room with a competence I noted and filed away for later. I moved through the preparation room and the patient room and the South Hall in a circuit that I stopped thinking about and simply ran on the knowledge my hands had accumulated over 6 years of this work. I made decisions quickly, and did not second-guess them, because second-guessing in these hours was a luxury that belonged to people who had time for it, and I did not have time. At some point, I could not have said exactly when, I became aware that Adrian was in the South Hall, not performing the role of king, not conducting an inspection or making a formal appearance. He was sitting with a group of Fern Hollow wolves near the far wall, listening. An older woman was talking to him with her hands moving in the agitated way of someone still caught in the event that had just happened to her, and he was listening with his full attention. The way he listened in the formal assemblies, but without the formal distance, leaning slightly forward, his elbows on his knees. I registered this and moved on, because there was still too much to do. By mid-morning, the immediate crisis had resolved into the longer, steadier work of sustained care. The 17 who had needed immediate attention were stable. The 9 who had needed attention within 4 hours had received it. The South Hall had settled into the quiet that follows the loud part, people sleeping or sitting in the particular stillness of those who have recently been frightened and are now, tentatively, safe. I sat down on a bench in the preparation room, set my hands on my knees, and allowed myself to stop moving for the first time in approximately 9 hours. Pip appeared with tea. He set it beside me without speaking, with the particular sensitivity of someone who has learned when words are not the appropriate offering, and I thought that he was going to be very good at this work someday, and that I was going to make certain he had the formal training to match what he already carried naturally. "You should sleep," he said. "Shortly," I said. "Go find your own rest first. You did well tonight." He ducked his head in the way he did when he didn't know how to receive a direct compliment and retreated. I drank the tea and looked at the stone work table and thought about nothing specific, which was what my mind did when it had been running at full capacity and needed to idle before it could think again. "Willa." Adrian stood in the doorway. He had been in the South Hall for hours and looked it, not disheveled exactly, because I was not certain he was capable of disheveled, but carrying the particular weight of a long night in his bearing, something more human and less architectural than his usual quality. "Everyone is stable," I said. "I'll do full rounds again at midday. There are 2 cases I want to watch through the next 24 hours, but I expect both to resolve without complication." "I know," he said. Sarah gave me the report. He was quiet for a moment. "I came to tell you something else." I looked at him. He moved into the room, not to the work table, not to the supply shelves, but simply further in, closer, with the deliberate quality of someone who has decided something and is now executing the decision without the hedging that uncertainty produces. "The Duskfang situation is going to require a formal response," he said, "military and political. There will be a council meeting within the week, territorial representatives will be summoned, and the process will take months before it resolves." He paused. "That is the part I know how to manage. That has always been the part I know how to manage." "Yes," I said, because it was true, and because he seemed to be building toward something. "What I did not know how to manage," he said, "before 11 weeks ago, was the part that the old woman in the South Hall reminded me of tonight. She lost her home. She lost 3 members of her extended family. And what she needed, before any formal response or political resolution or territorial guarantee, was for someone to sit with her and listen." He looked at the fire. "My father was good at that. I was told I wasn't. I believed it for a long time." A pause. "She told me just now that I reminded her of him." The room was very quiet. "I imagine that was meaningful," I said carefully. "It was." He looked at me directly. "You built that tonight. Not the individual moment. I did that. But the environment in which it was possible. The South Hall, the organization, the fact that those people were calm enough and cared for enough that there was space for something other than crisis." He stopped. "I have been watching you work for 6 weeks, Willa. I have been watching you since the morning I woke up on your cot in Crestfall, and I want to say something that I should have said more clearly before now." I waited. "What you did in the Ashwood was not a small thing that a more important person should have done instead. What you have done here, in this seat, in 6 weeks, is not a secondary thing that fills the gaps between more significant work." His voice was even and deliberate, the way it was when he said things he meant to land without ambiguity. "You are not a detail that needs to be managed or positioned or explained. You are the most capable person in this building at what you do, And I have not said that plainly enough. And I am saying it now. I looked at my hands for a moment. 6 years is a long time to carry the specific weight of being told, in the language of formal rejection and institutional invisibility, that you are adequate but not significant. The weight becomes so familiar that you stop noticing it as separate from yourself. It simply becomes part of your posture, the slight forward curve of someone who has learned to take up less space. I noticed, sitting there, that my posture had changed. Sometime in the past 6 weeks, without marking the specific moment, I had stopped curving forward. "Thank you," I said. Then, because I had learned that honesty was more efficient than deflection. That matters more than I would have expected it to. Something in his expression settled, like a question that had been waiting for its answer. "There is something else," he said. "Also something I should say plainly. You seem to be in a mood for plainness." "It's more efficient," he said, and the echo of my own reasoning in his words made something warm move through my chest. "The council meeting will require the presence of my senior advisors, Sarah, my lieutenants, the territorial representatives." A pause. "I would like you present as well, not in a medical capacity, or not only in a medical capacity. You observe things, Willa. You read rooms. You understand what people need before they know they need it. And you make decisions in complicated situations without losing the thread of what actually matters." He looked at her steadily. "Those are not medical skills. Or rather, they are not only medical skills." I understood what he was saying. I sat with it for a moment, the way I sat with things that required honest consideration rather than immediate reaction. "You're asking me to step into a role I don't have formal training for," I said. "You don't have formal training for half of what you do," he said. "That has not appeared to limit you." I almost smiled. "I'll need to think about it." "I know," he said, and this time he did smile, full and brief and entirely genuine, the kind of expression that appears when someone drops the management of their face for just a moment. "You always need a day." In the weeks that followed, the council met. The territorial representatives arrived with their retinues and their agendas, and the particular energy of powerful people in a room together, measuring and being measured. I sat at the long table and listened with the same attention I had always given to rooms I was trying to understand, and I spoke when I had something specific to contribute, and I watched Adrian manage 17 competing interests with a patience and precision that I found, privately, remarkable. The Duskfang situation resolved over the course of 3 months, not dramatically, not with a single confrontation, but through the slow, grinding work of formal response and territorial consequence, and the kind of political pressure that doesn't make for exciting stories, but does make for lasting change. The faction's leadership was brought before a formal tribunal. The Fernhollow settlement was rebuilt with resources pooled from 6 territories, a precedent that had not existed before, and that Sarah told me, with quiet satisfaction, would matter for decades. I built the healers program at the High Pack seat into something I was proud of. Formally trained staff, written protocols, a proper apprenticeship structure that meant Pip would have the credentials to match his ability before the year was out. Edric, who had turned out to be competent when stripped of his insecurity by simple necessity, became a reasonable colleague once he understood that I had no interest in the position he had coveted, and every interest in making the work itself better. And I learned, slowly and without ceremony, what it felt like to occupy a space that had been sized for you, rather than one you had been squeezing yourself into for years. On an evening in late spring, when the High Pack seat's stone walls had finally absorbed enough warmth to stop feeling cold to the touch, I was in the preparation room updating my protocols when Adrian appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of pine bark tea, made, I could see from across the room, with the precise measurements I had once written in the margin of a medical log that he had apparently been paying attention to. He set 1 cup beside me. He sat in the chair across the work table, the same way I had sat in the chair beside his cot in Crestfall, and I thought about that, about how much distance we had traveled from that frozen night, and how the thread of it was still visible if you knew where to look. "How is the Fern Hollow woman?" I asked. Her name was Dara, and she had stayed at the seat through the winter, and I had grown fond of her in the direct, unsentimental way I grew fond of people who said what they meant. "She's going back in the summer," he said. "She told me she wants to be there when the new hall is finished." A pause. "She also told me that she expects to be invited to the seat's autumn gathering, and that she will be evaluating whether the hospitality is worth the journey." "She'll come every year," I said. "She likes it here." "She likes you," he said. "She told me that as well, at some length." I drank my tea. The evening light was doing something particular to the preparation room, coming in at a low angle through the western window, making the stone walls look almost warm, catching the spines of the texts on the shelf and the organized rows of the supply table. "I like it here," I said quietly. It was a simple statement. It contained, as simple statements sometimes do, a significant amount of what was true. Adrian looked at me across the work table with the expression I had first seen in the firelight of my Crestfall dwelling. Careful and assessing, and underneath that, something quieter that had been growing with the patience of things that don't need to be hurried because they are already certain of themselves. "Good," he said, and then, "I want you to stay. Not as the head healer, though you are, and will remain, the best this seat has ever had. Not as the council advisor, though I would not want to run another council session without you present." He set down his cup. "I want you to stay because this place, and the work we do in it, and the people we have become in it, they are better with you in them. You are not a detail, Willa. You are not a secondary thing. You are the part of this that makes the rest of it make sense." The spring evening settled around us, warm and quiet, full of the sounds of the high-pack seat in its ordinary life. Voices in the corridor, the distant rhythm of the training yard, Pip's footsteps somewhere overhead, probably reorganizing the upper supply room again. I thought about a frozen forest floor, and a decision made without deliberation. I thought about 6 years of quiet, invisible work, and what it had built in me. Not bitterness, though it could have, but a particular quality of knowing exactly what I was worth, independent of what any room had decided to acknowledge. I thought about the moment I had walked out of my Crestfall dwelling with 3 cases and a travel bag, and a door I had closed without looking back. I thought about what it meant that I had stopped curving forward. "I'm already staying," I said, and that was the end of the story that had begun in a frozen forest. Not with celebration or ceremony or any of the formal acknowledgments that Pack Society used to mark significance, but with 2 people sitting across a work table in the late light of a spring evening, drinking tea. Both of them exactly where they were supposed to be. Dara came to the autumn gathering, as I had known she would. Pip received his formal healer's certification the following spring, in a ceremony that he spent the entire preceding week pretending not to be nervous about. Sarah's wrist, treated consistently and correctly, stopped troubling her entirely by midsummer. Edric published a paper on cold weather wound management that cited, with scrupulous accuracy, the field techniques developed by the head healer of the high-pack seat, and the woman who had once been an unaffiliated Omega in a settlement that had learned her name only when a king had said it first. She built something real, in a place that was real, with people who knew precisely who she was. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.